Hello, second grade readers. I'm so excited to do our first reading lesson together today. We are going to start our reading lessons by talking about fairy tales. Now, before we dive in, I want you to think, what do you already know about fairy tales? What are some fairy tales that you know? If you've got someone near you, tell them one or two fairy tales that you know. It could even be your dog. Ready? Go. So you may have told someone that you know the fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. And this fairy tale was in your learning packet last week that you got to read. Now you may have said the story of the three little pigs, or the three billy goats Gruff, or Hansel and Gretel. There's lots of fairy tales. Now first, I want to talk about what is in a fairy tale. What makes a fairy tale so special? So last week in your learning packet, you got this paper. And it says, what do we find in a fairy tale? So we're going to go over that first to refresh our memories. What makes a fairy tale so special? Well, first, fairy tales have good versus evil. We usually find some good characters that are trying to do something good. And then we find some evil characters that are making problems for those good characters. We also find magic. Now, sometimes this is a magic person, like a fairy godmother, or it could be a magic object. There's also special powers in fairy tales. Sometimes people have special powers, or sometimes it's animals. We also usually find royalty, which means there are kings and queens and princesses and princes usually in a fairy tale. We might also find some talking animals. This tells us that fairy tales are fiction, right? They're pretend. We also might find something in groups of threes or in groups of sevens. Now, fairy tales like to repeat things over and over. And sometimes you find things happening 3 times, like the three little pigs, or you might find things grouped in sevens. So be sure to keep an eye out for 3s and 7s. Now you'll also find that the beginning of fairy tales start in a special way. They usually start with words like once upon a time, or once there was, and that helps you to know that you're about to read a fairy tale. Okay. Now that we remember what fairy tales are, let's find out what we're doing today. We have a learning target for today that says, I am learning to find different story elements in a fairy tale. Now, we need to identify story elements because that shows us that we understand what we're reading. Now, let's remember what story elements are. Can you think to yourself, what are the story elements? I want to remind you with a story map. I know that you've seen this lots in your classroom. A story map is a way that we organize the story elements. So, one of the story elements are characters. Who is in the story? We also have setting. This is where the story happened and when it happened. And then we have the problem, what went wrong in the story. And solution. Solution is how the problem was solved. And finally, we have lesson. Now, fairy tales are really big on lessons. They want to teach you something, so we need to pay attention to the lesson in this story. So, this is the tool we're going to use to identify story elements. And the fairy tale that we're going to read today is in your learning packet, Hansel and Gretel. Today I'm going to read this to you, but I want you to have it out in front of you and read it along with me. So we're going to get started with that. This is Hansel and Gretel. Once there was a poor woodcutter. He was very poor. He had no food for his children, Hansel and Gretel. One night, the children went to bed. Their stepmother said, "We do not have enough food. We will starve if we go on feeding your children. Let us leave them in the woods." The little boy heard his father and his stepmother. He made a plan. He filled his pockets with small white pebbles. The next morning, the stepmother woke the children. "Come with us to cut wood." She gave them each a crust of bread. They went into the woods. Hansel dropped his pebbles along the path. When they were deep in the woods, their father built a fire. He told the boy and girl to wait until he returned. The children fell asleep. When they woke up, the fire was out. It was dark. "Father forgot us," cried Gretel. Hansel showed her his trail of pebbles. The pebbles were shining in the moonlight. They followed them home. Their father was happy to see them. The stepmother was mad. She took the children into the woods again. This time, Hansel had no pebbles. He dropped crumbs of his bread along the path. Again, the children fell asleep. When they woke up, Hansel looked for the trail of crumbs. The birds had eaten every crumb. The children wandered through the woods. They were hungry and scared. They came to a clearing. In the clearing was a candy house. The children broke pieces off the house and ate them. Suddenly a voice said, "Nibble, nibble like a mouse. Who is nibbling on my house?" They looked up to see an old witch with thick glasses. The witch peered at the boy and girl, and she grabbed Hansel. She threw him into a cage. She said to Gretel, "Come, little girl, you must cook. When your brother is plump, I will eat him." Each day the witch went to the bars of Hansel's cage. She told him to stick out a finger. Hansel wanted to trick the witch. He stuck a stick through the bars. The witch would peer at the stick, then she would mutter, "Still too thin," and stomp away. One day, the witch decided to eat Hansel, thin or fat. She built a fire in the oven. She told Gretel to see if it was hot. Gretel was afraid for Hansel. She wanted to trick the witch. She whined, "I don't know how to do it. Will you show me?" "Silly girl," screamed the witch. "I'll do it myself." So she opened the oven door and peered inside. In a flash, Gretel pushed the witch into the oven. She slammed the door closed and ran to Hansel. The children ran and ran through the woods. They found themselves back at their own house. Their happy father told them that their stepmother was gone. The children hugged him. From that day on, they took care of each other, even in hard times. Now that we have read Hansel and Gretel, let's fill out our story map. So this is where we're going to identify the story elements from Hansel and Gretel. Let's start with characters. Who were the main characters in this story? Go ahead and start writing them down, and then I will do the same. We have Hansel, Gretel. Those are the two main characters. We also have their father and their stepmother. And they met one more character. Who else was important? The witch. All right, now let's think about the setting. Where were the characters? And when do you think this happened? Go ahead and start writing, and I'll join you in a moment. Well, we know that the kids spent a lot of time in the woods. That's where the stepmother left them. And then when they were trying to make their way back home, they ended up at the witch's house. Now let's think about when this happened. Do we think that this was a story from the future? A story that could have happened yesterday, like the present? Or do you think this is a story from the past? Most fairy tales are from the past. This happened a long time ago. Now let's think about what is our problem in this story. Go ahead and start writing. Now I think there are two problems, so I'm going to split my section in half. I think one of the big problems was the stepmother wanted to do what? Get rid of the children. And then what was the next big problem that happened? The witch wanted to eat them. Definitely a big problem. So let's think about these problems. The stepmother wanted to get rid of the children, so she left them in the woods, and that's when the children ended up at the witch's house where she was going to eat them. So how did that get solved? How did both of those problems get solved? Go ahead and start writing that down. The kids did not let themselves be eaten. Instead, they tricked the witch and ran home. They made it home. And we know that when they got there, they found out the stepmother was gone. It didn't tell us what happened to the stepmother. That means we need to think and infer, what do you think happened? I think that probably the father was not very happy with the stepmother's plan, and he missed his children. I bet he told her to leave. Now, fairy tales always have a lesson. The person telling you the fairy tale wants you to learn something. I want you to think, what is the lesson in this story? I'm going to think about the main characters, Hansel and Gretel. Now, when their stepmother said that she wanted to get rid of them and left them in the forest, Hansel had a plan. He left pebbles behind to find his way back home. When they ended up at the witch's house, and she wanted to fatten him up, Hansel had a plan. He used a stick to trick her. And then, when the witch wanted to eat Hansel, Gretel had a plan, and she pushed the witch into the oven. Now that makes me think that these kids are problem solvers, and that's something we should be as well. So the lesson is, be a problem solver. They solved all of their problems that kept coming up. You might also think that the lesson is that they needed to be brave, and I would agree. They were brave during some pretty scary times. The lesson could also be teamwork, that Hansel and Gretel worked together to solve a big problem. Sometimes there's more than one lesson in a story. If you need to keep looking at this page, you can hit pause on the video to finish looking. Otherwise, I want to show you what's on the other side. On this side, this is what we use to retell a story. And I know that you've seen this before. So we're just going to talk about it, and then you get to do this part by yourself or with help from your parents. Now this is our retelling sheet. Don't forget your name and the title of the story, Hansel and Gretel. Now you're going to write down the characters, the main characters in the story. Not all of them, the main characters. And then what those characters wanted. But something happened. This was our problem. And then so because of this problem, what were the steps that took place? And then finally in the end, how was the problem solved? You're going to retell by yourself. And then we need your families to take a picture of the retelling side and the story map side and send it to your teacher. We would love to see the hard work that you have been doing, so please send us a picture of both sides, the story map and the retell. Great work, second graders, filling out your story map and retelling the story, Hansel and Gretel. Be sure to come back on Thursday to watch the next video for our next reading lesson. And on our next video, we are going to be talking about this sheet in your learning packet, where we're going to talk about character traits and the character traits for Hansel and Gretel. So be sure to come back to watch that video. Be sure to take a picture of your work and send it to your teachers. And I can't wait to see you next time. Bye.